the next section we're getting into is the moral ecology issue.
Yeah.
So, of course, this was the one that you wanted to raise, and I think the first point is the effect on children. So I don't know, however you wanted to start, of course, but maybe, of course, what do you mean by moral ecology?
Yeah, so I borrow that term from Robert George in his book, Making Men Moral. So George talks about how society, through our laws and through our practices, are teachers, essentially. So, for instance, like even though the Supreme Court technically, as much as like us conservatives would like the Supreme Court not always ruling on morality, there's kind of a recognition, though, that the whole institution of law doesn't make sense unless it's ordered towards the flourishing of the community. For instance, like a law, so Aquinas and even Martin Luther King, right, makes this argument that a law is unjust if it's against the natural law, and that there is no such thing as a mere positive law in which I assert by virtue of power what the law is supposed to be, right? Because there's always going to be the more fundamental natural law to hold that law against. So
explain that a little bit better. So go ahead.
Yeah, so basically, when we talk about the moral ecology of society, right, we recognize that human beings form institutions, form societies, right, because we're naturally ordered towards that end. And that end is flourishing. We flourish in a community. Now, there are two views on what the law does. But fundamentally speaking, we all recognize that the law is a teacher of sorts. So the law is going to say something, right? And it's going to make us, the Supreme Court, right, it's going to make a certain ruling. And it's going to end up influencing everyone's views or generations to come. So, for instance, like on the issue of gay marriage, right? Like when the Supreme Court ruled in Obergefell v. Hodges, and even when they struck down the Defense of Marriage Act, what we eventually saw was the debate on gay marriage ended. And most people just said, hey, the Supreme Court ruled, and that's the final bit, right? And we're done. But then we all recognize that, look, the law itself can be a good teacher and it can be a bad teacher. So it can't be the case that it's merely the positive law that is going to be the measuring stick of whether or not the law is a good teacher. It has to be the natural law. And the way that this connects all back to the moral ecology point is that basically, okay, if you recognize that the law is inherently going to be a teacher and influence the beliefs of a society, and even human beings in our private practice, what we consider to be normal and what we consider to be acceptable and tolerable is going to shape generations to come what they're going to believe. So we had better have a standard for what is going to be a good standard or a bad standard, what's going to hold up or not. And it can't be the positive law, because the positive law or the act of, let's say, legislating, the act of the power of enforcing a law, right, has to be accountable to the natural law. It's not its own moral domain.
Can morality be legislated?
I mean, it depends what you mean by that. I mean, we do it all the time, right? Like we say that you can't kill people. You have to respect private property. If you're pro-life, right, you understand that we have a certain vision on the value of human life and human dignity. So what, I mean, like, can morality be legislated? I mean, we do it already, but I guess like the question is more asking like, what's the limiting principle? Can I enforce every single moral principle? Something like that.
I suppose even can the state be involved in issues of morality, right? Or should we just leave, virtue and stuff like that to social institutions, churches, and stuff like that? I suppose that's usually how the line of conversation goes.
So when you look at the medieval political philosophers, they all talk about the body politic, and frame the body politic. They actually view the society or the state as an organismic unity. So they view it as a natural unity. And this is to say that, for instance, when the state uses its power, it's actually just as naturally part of the moral community as you individually are. So the state is not some separate, right, institution that's existing on some other plane. It's part of the quest for human flourishing, and it's meant to secure certain ends in question. And also, like, offers like 6 principles on what should limit the government. So we don't believe, for instance, that the government should be doing every single thing because it might be practically impossible. It could be the case that if the government is too powerful, then it discourages genuine, authentic human relationships from forming, right? Those are considerations that we can have. But the point is that the government gets the fundamentals wrong, or else it's like It's like if the organismic unity decided to shoot itself in the foot or in the stomach, right? It would be self-defeating.
Mm. Okay. So how does this body politic work exactly? How does this formulate what are the primal conditions to which this takes place?
Well, so I explained last time kind of like how the Aristotelian view on how societies form. So they form from the individual cooperating with other individuals, naturally forming familial and relational institutions, and then from their desiring to secure those institutions, those promises, those desires, that inheritance that you have, right? So these are all natural in the sense that they are things that human beings do, right? And these are not perverted or obfuscated, but this is just what you see human beings doing when they're fully allowed to, when they're flourishing.
Why should this community care for or provide protection for the familial structure? Should the community have an interest in the home, so to speak?
Yeah, so there are two things to talk about. So in George's book, he talks about it in the early 20th century. They actually had this debate on whether or not we can actually make a sharp distinction between public and private life. And the fascinating thing was that, like thinkers like H.L.A. Hart, and I forgot the other guy's name. His last name I think was Devon or something like that. They all kind of agreed that the distinction between public and private life is actually very superficial. So in principle, then it's going to be really hard to make that distinction. And they also knew that private vices always found a way to shape the public. So for instance, like so people think that like what I do in the bedroom is just totally sacred and private. But then in reality, we've seen that that has shaped actually significantly our politics. And when I wrote the paper on your website, I think it was the ultimate role of men in the pro-life movement. In that paper I talk about how actually when you have a corrupted view of masculinity, and oftentimes masculinity being related back to sexuality, right? When you have a corrupted view of masculinity, it's actually going to damage the pro-life movement. So there's no way to actually I mean, politics and sex go together like peanut butter and jelly. They're kind of just there together. I mean, I don't know how else to put it. They are part of the human story. They're part of the human community.
So let me frame this out because I'm actually glad you brought this up. Okay, so typically in politics, in matters of the state and etc., of course, we make that distinction between public and private. And what's interesting is that in the feminist conversation as to that distinction, right, their goal has been to make the private the political, right? So there's that common dictum in feminist thought that the personal or the personal is political. And so what's interesting is that a lot of feminists will point out is that in our theories of social justice, they typically are at the public level, but they stop once it gets to the private level, such that really our laws, as far as to what takes place in the home, domestic abuse, rape, and etc., we don't really have clarified laws or theories of justice which enter the home so explicitly. So I'm interested now to bring in kind of the feminist kind of conversation and to touch on that public and private distinction a little bit more. Is it the case that the distinction between public and private dissolves such that, we would view the sex act as a private act? But for example, there are feminists like Andrea Dworkin who would say that actually the sex act is the quintessential social act because it's the act of which a whole society is based, the whole superstructure, so to speak. How is one to think about that distinction? Is kind of basically my question.
Yeah, I mean, like, so one thing is that, I've actually even though I'm a conservative, I've been coming to respect a lot of what the left has to say on a lot of issues, including race, including gender for the most part, and even the feminist, right? And there's actually a book titled An Aristotelian Feminism, in which the author traces back a lot of these feminist ideas to actually the teachings of Aristotle, which is fascinating.
Yes.
Some people would say that Aristotle's not a feminist, but that's debatable. But anyway, or at least you have to borrow his concepts in order to construct a coherent framework. But
yes,
I mean, so Andrea Dworkin, I think, is absolutely right. The sex act really is the quintessential act. And if you think about it too, sex has such a power over our intellect and our appetites and our pursuits that it's going to shape a lot of how we see the world anyway. So for instance, well, and even going back to Andrea Dworkin's point, right? I mean, Aristotle makes his theory of government and of the origin of the state from the family unit. So already then we have this understanding that the Sex Act really has this fundamental nature to it. And I mean, I don't know what else you're expecting out of that, but I'm in agreement with her.
Yeah, well,
you're talking about, yeah. I mean, you're talking about the private-public distinction, right? Are you wanting me to articulate what the distinction actually is, or?
Well, I suppose of course, what would be our, or as you know, your own position, of course, but like, how would a Christian sort of understand this distinction a little better in their own terms? If I may, I'm going to read this quick passage from Catherine McKinnon's book, Toward a Feminist Theory of State. Very close sort of colleague, I guess you could say, with Angie Dworkin in the 80s and 90s with the feminist critique of pornography. Anyway, so she's writing about Angie Dworkin and saying, sexuality itself is a social construct gendered to the ground. Male dominance here is not an artificial overlay upon an underlying inalterable substratum of uncorrupted essential sexual being. Sexuality free of male dominance will require change, not reconceptualization, transcendence, or excavation. Pornography is not image in some relation to a reality elsewhere construed. It is not a distortion, reflection, projection, and etc. It is sexual reality. Angie Dworkin's Pornography presents a sexual theory of gender inequality, of which pornography is a core constitutive practice. The way pornography produces its meaning constructs and defines men and women as such. Gender is what gender means. So there's a sense in which we can borrow a lot of resources from that. But I have a problem with that notion of the public and the private dissolve, such that the sex act is solely a public act. So,
I see what you're saying.
So I want to understand that better, because there's a sense in which I'm starting to hear like Marxist kind of overtones to this, you know. But so I want to understand that better. So what is the frame of mind here?
Yeah, I mean, so when it comes to the distinction between the public and the private, I think the main thing is to keep in mind that because Aristotelians view things as unities, and they try to seek what is the unity in question, what is the total perfection at hand, what they're going to see is that human beings, each of them are individuals, right? It's not much of a question, right? Each of us are individuals, distinct tastes and appetites, distinct personalities. And then collectively speaking, by our natures, we form this conglomerate, we form this state and this society. So the public sphere is going to include all those things that shape, for instance, my life over here and your life over there, right? It's going to have this overarching consequence. Now, the private, now, for instance, when Aristotle talks about why the state should allow private property, and he argues against kind of his mentor and even Socrates's full kind of Marxism, basically, where everybody owns the means of production, right? And there is no distinction between public and private. Aristotle says the reason why we should have private property is because when a man is invested in his property and he knows that he exclusively has ownership to it, he is going to invest in it more heavily, and he's going to want to maximize it to its total perfection. Right. And that is a limiting principle for private property when it is ordered towards maximizing human flourishing. And for instance, when you look at like people like Milton Friedman, Ludwig von Mises, and so forth, they all talk about how like the private sphere is good by virtue of its maximization of something's potential. And we can talk about that over and over, but that's the distinction between public and private. It would be more like when you start saying I have exclusive ownership over something, and you have to respect that boundary, right? And that becomes more private. You get the private distinction, and then the public is obviously involved in it in some way, but the relationship, it has to be also has to be properly ordered based on the good. So, for instance, if the public totally becomes the private, or if the private totally becomes the public somehow, right, then you would have a disordered system. The thing that keeps them at bay is the good. And that's the only true limiting principle in question. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm trying to flesh out my thought a little bit better as to how this might function a little bit. Because so with, for example, there's that distinction between gender and sex, right? And some would say there is no distinction. Some would say that there is. And it seems like the language to which the private individual might dissolve, or the social is the private, might make sense under a more Platonic framework. And again, in that Marxist kind of sense, because Aristotelians tend to ground gender to biological sex. So there isn't you can't extract or extend the private in this conceptual sense to a social or a community. So that's the problem with which I have with the feminists in saying that sex is social, or that sex is the quintessentially social act.
Yeah, I see what you're saying now. So like it's kind of almost like, it reminds me of what Simone de Beauvoir said in the Second Sex, right? She said, one is not born woman, but one becomes woman, right? It's kind of this idea that gender and sex are totally social constructions, right? To the point where like they could be infinitely malleable by the public's eye, right? Or something like that. And what I'd say in response is twofold, right? So the first is that there is like a fundamental bedrock reality that we talk about when we look at men and women. So for instance, one thing we're going to expect is that men and women have many things in common because they're both rational animals, right? But when we look at like the social science data and we see the tendencies of men and women, and when we see that these tendencies manifest not because of any arbitrary imposition, but because genuinely speaking, like when you increase the freedom of a society, and even if you include, for instance, like feminist protections for women, right, to allow them to pursue all the fields that they want, I think in the Scandinavian countries, what they found is that the gender distinction became stronger, right, because you are allowing more freedom, and then the tendencies, the inert natures that are there, to become more powerfully manifested without obfuscation or social kind of limitation, right? So then we would say that the tendencies are actually manifestations of something grounded in a nature or in a reality. And even when we see bad tendencies manifesting, we're going to see, well, why are those tendencies manifesting? And we'll see that they're ordered towards some good, but they're failing to achieve that good. So, for instance, what we see is that men are more often accused of violent crimes than women. Let's take that one tendency that we see. Well, when Aristotle offers his theory of masculinity, he talks about the masculine passions, and I think one of them is like justice and leadership, and these involve kind of setting something in stone, getting something done, right? So when we see a man continue to use violence as his means of expression, we see that actually he has not had access to his full inner life, and he's using one passion of his, which could be the passion for justice and leadership, and just corrupting it, basically, right? Then, I mean, I'm also sympathetic to a lot of what the feminists have to say about like how society is a teacher and social constructs are teachers, but the problem there is that they're not totally arbitrary. They are acting upon some reality or some tradition that people have noticed about human beings. And that's like, for instance, like one example that I could use is maybe something like language, right? I mean, language is to some extent a social construct, but it's so natural to us that it reveals to us that human beings are ordered towards conveying meaning to each other. And that's like the fundamental assertion-making faculty. That's what John Skalko calls it, at least. Right. So I guess the Aristotelian would say, hey, let's do a both and, right? Or let's try to ground this tendency or this social norm in nature.
Yeah. So would you say, I mean, would you agree to like a both and kind of view? Of course, with respect to the nature and nurture debate, that as far as how one understands gender and sex, there is a sense in which there's, if you would agree, that there's a nature aspect, there's something fixed with respect to the nature of maleness and femaleness, but at the same time, there are nonetheless socially constructed features. There are characteristics, that vary.
Yeah, I totally agree. Because, for instance, as I talked about before, right, like the state is a natural kind of outgrowth from human society, and society is a natural outgrowth from human relationships and families and so forth, right? So I would not make a sharp distinction. I would make a distinction, like Aristotle did between private property and the role of the state, but I wouldn't make a sharp distinction between the two. So I don't think the state is totally
Yeah.
arbitrary or even unnatural, right? So remember, I'm not a libertarian.
Right.
If I'm a libertarian, then it would be harder for me to agree to some of the stuff that I've said.
No, you're right. No, but I was just thinking that, of course, it's important to clarify. I think for me anyway, that gender is tied to biological sex because you get a sense in which Plato and Aristotle are both essence-minded, but they have an emphasis as to where that emphasis or that essence lies.
Yeah.
So I would agree in some minimal sense that there is a fixed understanding of maleness and femaleness, and that's what gives meaning or intelligibility to the distinctions that we see in the cultural nuances for men. As to what they specifically are, I agree with actually most Thomist, Catholic philosophers that we can't really specifically say as to what those are. Like we can maybe name some examples like justice, leadership. I've heard other virtues like other stuff.
Well, like there's like spiritedness is one example that Aristotle uses. Men tend to be more kind of in the heat of the moment, passionate and physically oriented, right?
Right.
Especially in sports. For Aristotle, for the time of the Greeks, with the Olympics and everything, he would have been very familiar with that kind of very masculine sort of practice.
Yeah. So the reason I'm highlighting why it's important to say that why gender is tied to biological sex, because it makes it intelligible.
That's right.
Which is why we can provide a kind of extended criticism of, I'm sorry to my trans viewers, but why these arbitrary designations for people saying for whatever they want to be, LGBTQ plus, whatever label they want to give to themselves if they're a man or a woman. And that's why these are arbitrary and baseless, is because gender is not a concept. It's not an idea that we attach to something we want to be there, right? It's of course there's a lot going on with that issue, but it's changing kind of the
well, I mean, to get to the point about transgender individuals, right? I mean, what I'd say to them is that first and foremost, your body is beautiful, right? Your body is, I mean, for me as a Christian, your body is loved by God, is beautiful. You're a mind-body union. You're not an accident. This is not a mistake, right? And I mean, like, I'm saying this because I have a lot of transgender friends who I love deeply, and like I'll accommodate them when they have like gender pronouns and so forth because I don't want to cause unnecessary conflict, right? But because we're mind-body unions, right, and because we are ordered towards the good, we were ordered towards fullness and wholeness, right? And when we have this kind of discomfort with our bodies, right? I mean, like, sometimes even for me, for instance, I for due to some of the things that I've struggled with in the past, right, with eating disorders and stuff, I felt a kind of dysmorphia or kind of detachment from my body, right? But then when I found myself finally unified with my body, I found that I could be happier. I felt more integrated. I felt like things made more sense. And also for those people who want to transition, like this is just my opinion, and I want to philosophically back it, of course. But oftentimes when someone makes a transition from, let's say, man to woman or woman to man, they often go off of very rigid stereotypes on what it means to be a man or a woman, right? So they have to presuppose the stereotypes in order to even engage in the transition. If you're a biological male, right, and let's say you have this tendency towards feeling like a woman, or traditionally what women feel, guess what? You have the power to give us a new vision of masculinity, one that's better, one that's not toxic, and one that recognizes the beauty of the feminine, right? And that's what men need in order to be properly balanced. And just to make one last point too about Christianity, if you notice, when man preceded woman, that's when we had the fall. But in the case of Christ and the second Adam and the second Eve, at least from a Catholic perspective, remember, it was from the woman's seed that Christ came, right? So nature was properly reordered when man took his humanity from woman. That's when nature is reordered in the person of Christ. So Christianity already has a very high view of femininity, especially, at least for Catholics, and our Queen Mother, Mary. So to the men and the women who are watching, and for those who are struggling, right, you're beautiful, You are meant to be unified, and go out and redefine what the toxic culture is trying to tell us about masculinity and femininity, right? And I'm part of that journey too, trying to figure out what is the proper view of masculinity and femininity. So there's a nice little caveat.
No, that was beautiful, and at least from my perspective, hearing it, because we, like I said, we're gonna agree. But that was wonderfully said. But I imagine there might be an extent to which people are listening to this and still might find some degree of offense or repudiation with what we're saying.
Yeah, and I mean, like, the honest fact is too, like, I have no compulsion to try and change another person. Here's my stance. I love you. Here's my arguments and so forth. Let's reason together, right? But you're not a freak. You're not a I don't hate you, right? And in fact, like, I appreciate my friendships with people from the LGBT community. And that's all I can really say. I'm not out here to prove, right, that that, let's say, like, I'm a perfect person, right?
Yeah.
But, like, I will be there for you if you need me. Call upon me and I'll be there. And that's just like what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, of course. I mean, because this is one thing we can probably last touch on, and we can move forward. But especially in thinking of an evangelical or apologetics mindset, it's more about having a relationship with the person and not so much approaching someone with that worldview and then just presenting them with arguments as if it was your duty to convince them of something that they failed to consider. When
Right.
it's much more complicated than that. It's not convincing someone of an argument, but it's about, of course, loving them, right? And that's a practice that takes time. It takes discipline. It takes self-giving, etc. So, so I think your position was very sobering on this issue. So I really appreciate you taking that caveat. Now, as far as our moral ecology section, is there anything you wanted to wrap up in that area? So by all means, be sure to touch back on that. I don't know if we got to the children or men in marriage aspect yet.
I can get to that.
Okay, so those were the 3 points we had on moral ecology: how it affects children, men, and how it affects marriage as well. If you'd like to start.
Yeah, so let me begin. Man, like, each of these points are so rich that I could spend a long time talking about them, but I'll just try to give it as succinct a summary as possible, and then if you have questions, ask them, of course.
Of course.
So when it comes to the point on children, here's the thing. Yeah, okay. So what we've been generally noticing in society is a tendency to actually remove the idea of the child. So for a lot of my friends, I remember having a conversation with someone who was like a social activist, and he was telling me the idea of a child, the idea of child is itself oppressive because it introduces this power dynamic between an adult or a parent and a child, right? And then in the process, we need to start viewing children as early as they can be viewed as rational, autonomous individuals. So, for instance, in Ryan T. Anderson's book, When Harry Became Sally, he talks about, in that book, about how, like, a lot of cognitive scientists were trying to argue that children as young as, like, I don't know, like 5 or 7 are rational enough to make the decision if they want to go the full body transition. So for a lot of people, they'd say, no, that's not okay. But then, for some people, they argue, well, children are sufficiently cognitively developed to make that decision. So then children can make that significant decision about their sexuality, or not much of a decision, but about their sexual kind of manifestation of their body, right? And then in the process, you have people on the left also arguing that children should not be viewed as children, but should be viewed as, like, equal to adults and so forth. And then I remember talking to a friend of mine on this issue, and he actually said he believed the age of consent should be lowered to something like 15. And I've even heard some people argue it should be lowered to 12, right? Because they all argue, well, if they believe that sex is all just about rational consent, then you could technically make it lower in principle, right? You would just leave it to the discretion of each of the individuals. The state doesn't have a role to play here, for instance. And if you look closely, a lot of the laws that we have prohibiting marriage for minors, right? Even the idea of a minor is a developed tradition around the nature of what marriage is ordered towards, which is towards the family, right? And you can't have someone who's super young getting into that relationship if they're not ready for it, if they're not prepared, if they're not fully aware of all that is incorporated within that. So you wait until they're maybe biologically more mature, to use one example. So then in the process, here's the fourth dilemma, or the fourth kind of thing that matters. So most children who watch pornography, I think it's like the age 11 is when they
Hmm.
become exposed to
Yeah.
pornography. And it's a high, alarmingly high number of young boys who are becoming aware of this. So then in the process, I mean, and then you also have young girls, and then you have the boys showing the girls what they want, and the girls are paying attention to social media, looking at porn stars being promoted on Instagram and stuff like that, and seeing what men want, especially what other boys want. And then, Robert George too talks about how children in social media and in advertising have already also been sexualized as well. And also for some odd reason, like we've been seeing a lot of stories about people in power preying upon really young children, and it's just a disgusting phenomenon. But anyway, like when you have all of this combined together, it is a recipe for disaster. Because if you don't have that limiting principle, then a lot of these derivations are going to be unstoppable. But then also when you introduce children to sex when they're so young, and you prematurely awaken those desires, and you put no protections in place, right? And like, to be realistic, right? Like we say, for instance, we should just leave it to the parents, right? Well, then it's like sometimes the parents try their best and the kid's going to find it anyway, right? Or like things aren't properly policed. I mean, it's relatively easy to find pornography on your phone. It's not that difficult. Go on Instagram and then you can see a model posing almost naked, right? You have all these problems and all these dilemmas put into play. And the point here is that I was really appalled when this friend that I was arguing with basically said, "Yeah, I think that it could be permissible for a child to have sex with an adult." In principle, then what we're basically calling pedophilia,
Mm.
right? And he was saying, and I was still kind of appalled by this, but he was basically saying like pedophilia is permissible so long as the two parties are rationally consenting. And then you ask the question, well, how does the child even know about sex? Pornography. So then that kind of, it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Mm.
And that's when it goes to the moral ecology point, right? Because pornography, because it's so popular and people want to normalize it. I mean, think about Pornhub and Bang Bros, right? They want to normalize pornography in society. It's going to shape everyone's perception of it to the point where even children will be exposed to it and think it's normal. And then they'll have their premature sexual awakenings. And then as everyone wants to lower the age of consent, bam.
So now, is this a justification of, okay, so as you were saying how this all kind of fits together before, is this a justification of pornography kind of itself, or the justification of the pedophiliac kind of inclusion here, or is it both?
When you say justification, what do you mean?
So you had made a claim.
Yeah.
I'm kind of forgetting it at the moment, but you're saying in which, how does a 15-year-old have an idea of sex? Well, pornography. Is that?
Oh, so the point there is that as people start making the move to lower the age of consent, and then you start thinking about, well, how's like an 11-year-old child going to know about sex or have that desire, that intense passion at that young age,
Yeah.
right? To make themselves an actual to actually rationally go out and say, hey, I consent to this activity, right? That's how you fill in that gap.
So it's they're being exposed to pornography, and this exposing is what informs them on their understanding or their concept of sex, and hence that's what justifies the move, like to go down. Is that the view here?
Okay, so yeah, maybe I should be more clear, right?
Okay.
So here's the thing. I'm arguing that first, like let's say like first pedophilia is immoral,
Mm-hmm. Of course.
right? And then pedophilia is immoral, and there's this problem, right, where people want to start lowering the age of consent. So we need some kind of limiting principle to know when to stop and say this is not okay.
Yeah.
Right. So the principle that we have right now, based on largely just secular liberal morality, is, well, if the two parties are rationally consenting, right, then they can engage in the sex act. And then people talk about, well, it has to be rationally consenting adults. But then we've seen recently in terms of decisions about gender transition, you're right, that's kind of becoming more questionable, at least on that side of the aisle, right?
Yeah.
And then moreover, with pornography being so popular in society and being normalized further, especially children having access to it, right? they are going to slowly become considered rational consenting parties.